Welcome back to the Power and Market podcast. I am your host today, Tho Bishop. No Ryan McMakin this week, but we are joined by two members of our editorial staff. Our usual co-host, Connor O'Keefe, with his Wednesday articles, and our senior editor at Mises.org, Bill Anderson, who contributes every Thursday morning on The Wire. Big week on The Wire this week. A lot of great stuff. We have Jonathan Newman responding to Richard Werner. We've got some interesting articles focused on South America and a lot of spending going on in July that Ryan covers. But this week on Power and Market, we're going to be looking at questions of law enforcement, particularly federal law enforcement. Big news at the start of the week with the federal government's takeover of D.C., a Trump agenda item on trying to, in response to the beating of Doge member Big Balls coming in and then reinstating order, if you listen to the Trump administration on that. And we're also going to dive a little bit on the topic of the Oklahoma City bombing that I know was featured on Tucker Carlson's podcast recently with a new book coming out that Bill has covered in an article of his. But we'll start off with the federal takeover of D.C. And Connor, we'll start with you. I know this is kind of an interesting issue. Capital City, obviously always a lot of police presence here. What were your response to the news when you heard about it? And I know there's been some drumbeat for quite some time about possibly getting to this point. But we'll start off with you on your views on this topic.
Well, there's like a lot of different angles to this story, and some things that I like and other things that I don't like. I'm certainly not a fan of violent crime and think it should be stopped whenever it can be. And like DC is one of the more dramatic examples, but it's true with a lot of blue cities around the country where like these progressive prosecutors are coming in there. And especially kind of after all the George Floyd stuff back in 2020, it was like this ideology took hold that there should just be an across the board decrease in policing, especially for these lower level offenses that, you know, we would still consider like violent property crimes, shoplifting, things like that. But this is something that a lot of times gets sort of lumped in with like libertarianism too. You'll hear that point brought up. But really, like, we are often, you know, criticizing the cops, criticizing government law enforcement. But at least for our sort of flavor of libertarianism, it's not about them existing. It's about the fact that the government monopolizes this very important service. Mm-hmm. And then oftentimes, as we've seen in recent years, and as is the case in DC, they then withhold that service. And that is like something that we should also be criticizing the government for too. It's not just when they crack down on rights. It's also when they come in and like using their monopoly over this, withhold that service, and through that allow people to violate the rights of other people. And so like the situation in DC in terms of who controls all this is complicated. There's a whole legal history there. But the fact was that like, and I think back in like 2022, the district attorney, like it was something like 2/3 of all the arrests, they just declined to prosecute. So like this was a serious problem in the city, and the city is like you know, they're sort of spinning it right now as like the crime rate's going down, and it's at like 30-year lows, which I think is some like statistics trick there. But the fact is, like, it's still, I think it's one of the 20, it's in the top 20 most dangerous cities in the country. And a lot of that is because of this kind of progressive prosecutor ideology there. And so Trump basically taking over, I think technically he gets 30 days is how this specific thing works. But it's just, it's like a question of control here. It's not really like some people are trying to frame it as like a resource thing, like, oh, he's like mobilizing all these resources. But it's like the police in DC, they had the resources to do this. It was just that the local government there was refusing to do anything about it. So by taking control of it, the federal government under Trump can actually start cracking down on some of this violent crime. And yeah, like I said at the beginning, like I want violent crime to be cracked down upon. I would prefer, you know, of course, I'm a Rothbardian. I would prefer it to be through agencies that, you know, if they're doing a terrible job, you can then opt out of that and go somewhere else. I don't like monopolies here, but I do like think that if people are violating other people's rights, that should be stopped. And so I am a fan of that kind of just that angle of it. To the extent that's happening, that alone, I support that. Where it gets a little more complicated, as I'm sure we'll get to in the second half of this episode, is I am not a fan of these federal agencies, and I do not think that the American right especially should be throwing their support behind them, even, or at least like with this kind of situation, some of this has clearly been like optics stuff. You have like police walking around nice like Georgetown areas with, I saw some of them had like vests full of magazines and no rifles. Like a lot of it is just about optics. But my point is like, even like the most charitable interpretation of like what the federal government's doing here, I still think the right move is to be highly, highly skeptical whenever these, the FBI, the ATF get involved. That's my very varied take on this.
Bill, as a former Maryland resident, how do you feel about what's going on in D.C. this week?
Well, I'm like Connor, and I'm of two minds about it. Number one, I do think that, for example, with the lower crime rates, a lot of it, other than murders, because you actually have a dead person, but a lot of crime is sort of downgraded, or they don't report it, or whatever. In other words, they do trick the statistics on this. And Washington, D.C. is perceivably not safe. There are a lot of carjackings. And, unfortunately, a lot of it gets tied in with racial politics and who's the victim and who's the victimizer, and also just the age of the people committing crime. You've got in Washington, D.C., you have a lot of juveniles committing crime. And I mean, a lot of the carjackings are kids, they're teenagers. And, and so there's that attitude, well, we don't want to ruin some kid's life because he's out there carjacking at age 15. We don't want to be paying for this when he's 50 years old. That kind of, and to a certain extent I understand it, but here is the thing. I think that it's very hard to get what I would call a rational or, certainly a rights-based discussion on this sort of thing because of the politics involved. On the left, it's, Radley Balco, for example, is claiming that Trump is now trying to establish police states everywhere. Well, I have no idea about that. I mean, I don't know what's in Trump's mind. I do think that there is a real problem when you militarize the police. Putting the National Guard is not a police force, and you have to understand that they're not a police force. They're not trained as police officers, and good policing involves a lot more than just a show of force. On the other hand, and here's a real problem, is that in places like D.C., they've come to accept this crime. It's been normalized. Mm-hmm. And on the whites on the left believe, well, maybe you should just have chaos. Like in Minnesota, I remember one of the councilwomen saying, well, it's just not right that, if it's white privilege if they go over in the white areas and whatnot. In other words, they go in the areas where there's not a lot of crime being committed in the first place. But I think that, because things are tied up with this, that the people have come to accept a good bit of this. And also that you do have elements in the black community that if they think that the blacks are attacking the whites, maybe that's not such a bad thing, and maybe they've got it coming to them. And I know that's a hard thing to say, but there is some of that attitude there, and you have to be careful about it because not everybody feels that way. A lot of black people living in these places would like to see the crime cleaned up. They also know if they speak up that they're going to get shouted down by others, especially the ideologues. So it's not an easy thing. I think that I have no idea if crime is at a 30-year low. I do remember back in the early 90s when D.C. was considered the murder capital of the world, And that's when they pulled that little crack cocaine deal with Marion Barry to get him out, because they were hoping that would, lead to some kind of crackdown on crime. It's hard to tell. But, again, when you've got a mixture of activism, progressive politics, when you inject progressive politics into the mix like this, you're going to get a lot of bad things, because progressives, what they do is they're very good at eating the seed corn. That's their feast. Somebody else has built up the city, built up the infrastructure and all that, and now we're going to come in and we're going to impose a certain kind of ideology, because we think everything that's been done wrong everything is up to this point has been done wrong. And so D.C., let me give you an example. I remember years ago, there were certain parts of the city where they would not deliver pizzas, because so many times what they would do is give them an address. The driver would go there and get robbed and sometimes killed. And so drivers didn't want to go there, and the companies didn't want to put their drivers in danger, so they stopped going into certain places and said, if you want a pizza, you got to meet us at this place here. Well, the city council members really got angry, and it's like, if you want to do business in the city, you should be willing to do it. That's racist. And, it wasn't a case, by the way, of whites going in and being attacked by blacks, or whites attacking blacks. It was a case of blacks, often, young black men robbing and killing other people, usually other young black men who were drivers, or a lot of times they would be foreigners, Indian from Africa, whatever. And so it was, when you have an attitude like that, you really can't do very much, because if you're willing to normalize this kind of violent crime, well, then anyone on the outside who speaks out against it, you're going to shout them down. Or a person like Trump, who they're always looking for to pin another label on him. When he does it, why then automatically, well, it must be racist. And, and by the way, I'm not even addressing whether or not this policy will work, or the efficacy of sending in the National Guard. That's a whole other discussion. Maybe we'll have it today. But nonetheless, that we've got to look first. People don't, they don't like the optics, because they don't want Trump doing it. And even, by the way, even if it results in fewer murders, less crime, that people can actually walk the streets more safely, that is still unacceptable to progressives.
Well, that's kind of what I'm curious about, how this actually looks like over the next couple months, because, our politics is distracted by unserious things. Yeah. There is no city that is less serious than D.C., and so much of what I see from this, like, again, if it kind of like what you mentioned, right, is it just National Guard troops, or LARPing, essentially, of walking around war zones and just kind of creating the aesthetic presence? Because again, DC was always, I think they had the most police per capita of any city in the country. That did not stop them from having, I saw, like, even with the declining crime statistics, and be those what they are, and all the questions that go into that. I think it's the fourth most dangerous city, much larger than, in terms of violent crime, than New York or Chicago or Atlanta even. So those other cities are not of the same sort of scale and stature which you would think of the national's capital. Again, is any of this going to really lead to a change of policy? And really what this comes down to at the core is a broader conversation about what does the city of D.C. mean? Right? Like, is there the home rule component to this? Obviously, we've seen it from the left, the desire to turn D.C. into a separate state as a way of packing a few more Democrat representatives in Congress, ultimately as the thing there. D.C., you have so much of a transplant population given the short-term nature of political jobs, at least elected jobs, right? Obviously, we know the deep state, a lot of them live in Virginia or Maryland. And so, like, the population there is very unique. It's the most ideologically probably captured city, right? You look at, like, voting behavior, and it's like, 90-10 Democrat, Republican. So it's a weird, and I think the interesting conversations out there are, what should we think about D.C. itself as an entity? I know there's been some proposals out that rather than making D.C. a state, maybe like actually rewrite the lines of what the District of Columbia is to push more territory back into Maryland. I think particularly on the Maryland side of the border and things like that. But again, you have this imperial capital that is self-governing. It's self-governing by a very overtly ideologically captured faction. It's an extremely incompetent. I mean, DC has never been known for competency. A long history of just incompetent leadership. And again, you just can't have people being beaten to the death. You know, like, and yeah, I mean, you know, in the nation's capital, that creates all sorts of different concerns here. But again, but how much of this is actually real? Like, how much of this actually? And I think Trump even mentioned in a press conference, like, people feel safer as a response to that. Now, again, how much of that is is actually felt by the average DC resident who doesn't like Trump? Right? It might be Trump is not known for his hyperbole, of course. But you know, is this just about feelings? Is it about vibes, or is it actually going to relate to anything that's actually going to change violent crime statistics? Yeah, I think the jury is out on that. But again, it just seems like another one of these very sort of ceremonial optics things at this point, rather than anything of meaningful difference.
Especially since it's only like 30 days, I think, and sort of regardless of, like, even if you're talking about the different like legal distinctions that DC could have going forward, like, even if there's a full federal takeover and it just becomes a federal like entity, it's still like the next time a Republican's out, then the Democrats are right back in power, and like the breakdown in the actual city is already like you said, 90-10. So like really, I think it's like this. It's these ideas that are like the root of the problem. Like I said earlier, it's not a resource issue here. Like there's a tremendous amount of money being spent on policing here, and Trump coming in and like bumping up the resources a bit. Yeah, like like there is, of course, like effects to like having people out there. Yeah, maybe walking heavily armed guys around will like knock that back a little bit temporarily. But like it's not like that's going to go on forever. It's not like he's going to have the National Guard, like the National Guard are just going to be policing DC for the rest of time. It's all going to go away, and it'll be interesting to see what they do when this 30-day limit on, I guess, taking over home rule is up. But I don't know. I'm not particularly optimistic about the crime in DC going forward. I think it's sort of, I'm just grouping it in with all these other blue cities. There's some rotten ideas running their city governments, and as long as those rotten ideas are still there, the problem's going to persist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that no matter what, I mean, I've never seen yet a city governed by progressives, and I'm talking about really ideological progressives where they have substantial power, a city that ends up not becoming dysfunctional. Here on the West Coast, you know, you saw what happened to San Francisco when it really went left and it deteriorated. Seattle's deteriorated. Portland's a joke. And Los Angeles, you know, they can't rebuild after the fires, and you know, you got a communist in Karen Bass, and so yeah, you've got, you know, that progressive governance is an oxymoron because it's really dysfunctional governance because they don't believe in any of those things. They don't believe in policing. They, you know, there shouldn't be any prisons. There shouldn't be any prosecution of crime. It's all capitalism. Just want to get rid of capitalism, have, you know, bring back, you know, give us something akin to North Korea or the Soviet Union and everything will be great. And so you can't govern under those circumstances at all.
Yeah. So that you know, it'd be very interested to see how that experiment continues to play out there. But and Connor, as you mentioned, this kind of does bring like a lot of the underpinning support for this on the right. I mean, part of it I think is just, you know, people always love sticking the finger in DC circles, which I can sympathize from time to time. But you know, it is kind of this larger, I think, sort of energy. I mean, now that our guy's in charge, FBI, you know, this federalization of law enforcement services. Again, it's always easier to support when you have your guy theoretically in the top of command. I'm still waiting to see where the Epstein investigation goes there, but I think there is some important to understand the history of the way that the FBI and some of these agencies has operated in practice. And I think, you know, some of the stories, particularly from the 90s, of such a fascinating period of American history, right? It's depicted as such a golden age in hindsight because of certain economic things and things like that. But like the, you know, situations like Oklahoma City, like Ruby Ridge, obviously at Mises.org we've covered. We have our own very revisionist take on the government's approaches to some of these sort of things. But I do think that the conversation about the Oklahoma City bombing, particularly with the new book that came out, that you reviewed, Blowback, the Untold Story of the FBI in the Oklahoma City bombing by Margaret Roberts. I do know, just worth noting to our listeners, that when she was on Tucker Carlson's podcast, that led to a lot of social media activity. It's like, oh, well, if you're interested in this story, she left out this, she left out that in that interview. And again, there's a lot to read within this topic. But Bill, I'll open it up with you. Can you talk a little bit about your takeaways, someone who's very well versed already in that period, knowing of those narratives, knowing that story, knowing the holes in the government line, you're revisiting this topic with this book. What are some of the big takeaways that you think a millennial, a Zoomer, some of our younger listeners who are not around for that, why do you think the Oklahoma City bombing continues to be one of those stories that still resonates in contemporary political discourse?
Well, I know you're going to be shocked to hear this, and I hope that both you and Connor are sitting down when I tell you this, but the FBI's narrative is a lie.
Ah.
So, obviously, as the audience gasps and recovers, but what I did in the review was I started out with the FBI's take. I went to their website and they got, we left no stone unturned. This was exhaustive, and ultimately it's the lone nut, Tim McVeigh. He drove by himself, never had built a fertilizer bomb before, but he builds this huge fertilizer bomb with the help of Terry Nichols. Nichols didn't go down with him, and they had some logistical help from Michael Fortier and his wife, and so what ultimately happened was McVeigh went and set off the bomb, and through some good police work, his getaway car didn't have a license plate, and so he got pulled over, and they decided to hold him, and then the FBI found that he was their man, and so on. So he gets executed for it. Terry Nichols is in prison. He's over at Supermax right now, living his 23 hours a day in solitary, and that 48, his wife went, served a little prison time, then went to WITSEC, witness protection. So they're all, and that's the story, and the moral of the story is that you have these guys like McVeigh who are troubled, and they listen to all this anti-government rhetoric that came about during the 1990s, and they just decided to act on it. And so the moral of the story is, don't criticize your government, or be very careful who you criticize, and especially don't criticize the Democrats or anything coming out of Washington, D.C. Don't criticize the FBI, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, or ATF, or any of these other. Don't criticize ICE. Don't criticize anybody. Unless, of course, you don't like ICE. Now you can criticize them. But that was their narrative. Now, the other thing that she deals with is the murder of Kenneth Trentadue, which the FBI insists to this day was a suicide. That is an absolute and total lie. There's no way to get around it. What the FBI, the way it works is we'd be better off without you, then somehow you mysteriously hang yourself in your jail cell, and but the problem was in this case that this Kenneth Trentadue was quote found dead, hanging from a vent 12 feet off the floor with a very, very short thing. He would have had to leap from the top of a sink, reach up there somehow with a very short bed sheet, that had been woven, and it would have taken an hour to weave it, and they only had a window of about 20 minutes, but somehow magically did that, tied it, and got it around his neck and hanged himself. And, it's one of those things, if you believe that, there's a bridge in Brooklyn I want to sell you. But, but that was Eric Holder's job. That guy's name comes up and later becomes U.S. Attorney General. So covering up a murder, which is a felony, is absolutely no barrier at all to becoming the most powerful law enforcement officer in the United States. But the problem was they let the Trenadoos know your son hanged himself, and they go, oh, he did, huh? This is interesting, and we're going to cremate the body. And it's like, no, you're not. And so they had the body sent in a wooden coffin, and when they got all the makeup off of it at the funeral home, find out that this guy's got burn marks all over him, stun gun stuff. His throat, there's an incision in his throat. Turns out that it was done by plastic handcuffs. They figured that out. And there was just a lot of other things. There was a lot of blood in the cell. The FBI would not let anybody in, police to examine it. They painted over the walls, cleaned it up, painted over the walls, and months later, the medical examiner did come in with luminol, said it just place just lit up all over the place. So in other words, and he bore a striking resemblance to this John Doe number 2. Now, those of us who followed it, I was, I was 41 years old when that happened, and like everybody else, I followed this thing in the aftermath religiously, and that there was FBI was insisting there was a John Doe, the witnesses said there was this guy, when they rented the Ryder truck, which blew, that there was this fellow with him. And finally, the FBI starts saying, well, there is no John Doe number 2. That's a figment in your imagination. Do not believe your lying eyes. And all these people didn't believe their lying eyes. They believed them, but they were told, no, he was with somebody else, etc., etc. And so right away you've got all this lying going on. What's actually happening? And so in the whole John Doe number 2, it's like a secondary story in this, but by investigating his brother's murder, because one of Kenneth's brothers was an attorney named Jesse Trenadue. And Jesse, I remember him from his track days at the University of Southern California. He was a better middle distance runner than I was. I wasn't bad, but he was better. But Jesse and I have had a lot of correspondence over the last 20 years. And so he started investigating this. And ultimately, he and some others, the main journalists, ABC News tried for a while, but then the top people decide, after a lot of pressure from the FBI, decide to kill the story and fire the producer. And so, which I know is shocking to both of you, but and I really don't want either of you to be too disheartened because I'm saying things about your government that maybe you thought were true, but the point is, though, that as they investigated, they found a very, very different story about Oklahoma City than what the FBI and the New York Times and all the regular news outlets have been telling us. And far from being this lone nut, the lone wolf, killing and all that, that indeed there were a lot of people involved. This is a lot of very shadowy characters, a lot of people coming in and out of this place called Elohim City. And I'm going to stop there because I need to give you a little background on this. And this goes back to the late 1970s and the Carter administration, when we had double-digit inflation. And at that time, if you know anything about commodities, that farmers actually, commodity prices were rising faster than inflation. So the Department of Agriculture told a lot of farmers to, hey, this is your time, man. Go after those marginal properties, plant, plant, plant. That inflation is here to stay, and that this is your chance to get rich. And so a lot of these people went into debt big time, and they plowed up the fields and did everything. Well, Paul Volcker puts the brakes on inflation, drops it from over 13% down to close to zero, at least officially with the CPI. And what happens in those situations, commodity prices will outpace the CPI going up, but it'll also outpace it going down. And so crop prices fell rapidly and precipitously. A lot of people lost their property. I remember Dan Rather doing a broadcast from a farm being auctioned, especially in 1982 to 83. There were movies like The River with Mel Gibson, Country with Jessica Lange, and others that dealt with this, and people all of a sudden losing their farm. Things being auctioned off, and all of a sudden you pack the family into your station wagon, drive off, and try to figure out what you're going to do next. And a lot of people became disaffected. And I remember interviews with people where, like, guys had been farming, and I remember this one guy, his eyes were just kind of just looking wild, and he starts blaming the Jews and other people, and people, they kind of lost their minds. But a lot of these folks, they sort of drifted into these Midwestern and Western communities, place like Elohim City. You had a lot of disaffected people then, let's put it that way, and disaffected people do things after they're disaffected that they wouldn't do beforehand. And so you had that. Also, after the Gulf War, there were a lot of vets, frankly, who were sort of disillusioned. And you had some of these separate type communities and the like. The Randy Weaver situation at Ruby Ridge in Idaho certainly got a lot of attention, in part because the way that I believe this was an FBI operation, and that the way that they entrapped him and then ultimately killed members of his family for nothing really. So you had that, the Waco massacre. Again, it was the media, and they joined forces with the Clinton administration to try to make this look like another Jim Jones situation, where these fanatical followers of David Koresh decided to all commit mass suicide. And so the one thing that was not coming out was the truth, and you knew that it wasn't true. And you happened to have the kind of president, Bill Clinton, who really, he made people mad anyway. And, he was, there are a lot of similarities to Donald Trump in some ways. Bill Clinton had a lot of marvelous political qualities, or certain skills or gifts or whatever. But he also had the ability to make people really angry, and the way he did things. And so you had this whole mix of stuff going in. Okay, and when you have these movements, then the FBI tries to infiltrate them, and they use confidential informers, or they will actually use actual agents. That's like what they did with the Ku Klux Klan. The big joke with the Klan was they knew who the FBI agents were because they were the ones who paid their dues on time. And you had a lot of that. So, and the notion that a guy like Tim McVeigh is just going to, on his own, decide, I'm going to build a huge fertilizer bomb, we're going to do like this. is, the probability of that happening is about zero. And this thing, there were a lot of really shadowy characters that, and I'll tell you what, Roberts does, I think, a very good job of dealing with all the players in the program. I mean, there are so many names and so many little weaving in and out stories that would be very, very hard to get right. And Jess had years, and 20 years to investigate, where Roberts did not have as much time. She got involved fairly early, through America's Most Wanted, where she worked, and through other journalistic endeavors. But there are a lot of players in this program, a lot of very suspicious people, and a lot of people that you realize have FBI ties. And turns out that one of the organizations, I think like the Aryan Resistance or something like that, really was an organization started by the FBI. Okay, now we go back to their tactics during the Intel Pro thing with, when they were infiltrating the left, and they would start these organizations, and a lot of times it was the FBI leading the violence. And so this was one of those classic cases where, the FBI was going to do what the FBI always had been doing. And so now the question arises, okay, if this is the case, what did they know and when did they know it?
Yeah. And there's so much there that's like it's the playbook created for the War on Terror afterward. Like this is what the FBI has done for so long of its existence.
Yeah,
Jim Bovar's done a great job of documenting a lot of the history of the agency. So this is the playbook that DC has run for decades now. That's brought us to this point.
Yeah, and now you have to ask the question: okay, who is involved? I mean, you got people like Andreas Strassner, and the FBI narrative on him is not very believable. There was this real ideological guy came over from Germany, and he's leading this white Aryan resistance, and I'm thinking, yeah, right. I mean, the FBI knew about him, Strassner, and how did, and there was another question that she raises. How was it that Tim McVeigh, with no job, was able to go from travel all over the place and live here and live there and be able to stay in motels and eat meals and the like? I mean, you got to have money for that. And if so, where was he getting it from? Was he in the being paid by the FBI himself as an informant? There are just a lot of questions. There was an ATF informant who was she knew something was going on, and she tried to blow the whistle, and suddenly the FBI decides they're going to try to prosecute her for something else. And this is another thing. And at some point you ask yourself, okay, where did this bomb plot get hatched? Who hatched it? Who helped carry it out? And then what did they know, at FBI headquarters? And in fact, like Jesse Trenadu reminded me that PatCon, that was Patriot Conservative, and this was their infiltration program. And PatCon was really run out of the Clinton White House. Now, it was begun by the Bush White House, all right? And in fact, you can see the Bush in your mind, given how, Bush being head of the CIA, him being very much a Washington establishment sort of person. He wanted to lead, the presidency back to where it had been, this kinder, gentler thing, and get it away from these people like Ronald Reagan. And so I could see him, starting an organization like that, and of course the Clinton White House jumping on it. Now here's the thing: after the bombing, no politician, nobody benefited more than Bill Clinton. he and his political guru Dick Morris, they sat down and how are we going to use this, and they basically were able to totally change the political fortunes of Clinton and the Democratic Party. They'd been absolutely routed by the Republicans the previous November in the elections. The Republicans, for the first time in 40 years, had taken the House, for God's sake. And they had strong majorities in the House and Senate. They had their contract with America, and the question was, how relevant is Bill Clinton? Well, after Oklahoma City, boom, they were able to turn and say, look what the Republicans have done. They have look at they're responsible for this. And of course the media jumped on that. I mean, the New York Times, my God, they blamed Sarah Palin for the shooting of Gabby Giffords. There was no connection whatsoever, not even with any of her rhetoric or anything. But this is how these guys work, and so then the question is, again, who knew what? When did they know it? And that's unanswerable. And so you do not see her, Roberts or even Jesse himself jumping into, the Clinton White House planned the bombing and then carried it out. That they're not going to go there. I'm certainly not going to go there in the article, and I don't know. All I do know is that after the bombing, Bill Clinton's political fortunes changed greatly.
Well, and that's the thing. The culture of genuine right-wing backlash to the state was really, a lot of these incidents fueled it. You had a lot of, it was a very different time. To me, I think it's very fascinating being a millennial, going back and watching X-Files back in that time.
Yeah, she brings up X-Files a lot in there. She says this is like something out of X-Files.
Well, that's the thing. So I guess the tone of that entire thing, which was written by, I think probably a liberal guy. He was like a Watergate era government skeptic, right? But so much of that was about how you can't trust the FBI, you can't trust these agencies. This was a very mainstream discourse going on at that time. And then they end up bombing. They have a bombing of a federal building near their movie that came out, and they had to spend the next season distancing themselves from this sort of stuff, which I think is very interesting. But this was the mainstream feeling that time, and it was Oklahoma City and everything that went on there. They passed a proto version of the Patriot Act during this period that was focused on these right wing extremists, right? They created this entire demonization of these right wing militia groups and the like to try to capture that energy and that backlash that was growing. And what I think is interesting in the last couple of years, the last decade or so, is that a lot of those emotions, have been a very motivating force for stuff that's going on in the broader political sphere. So it leads to the questions, and you kind of saw a desire to kind of get back to almost Clinton-like aesthetics with the Biden and crack down on right-wing groups and things like that. But that's kind of the dangerous thing here, though, is that if your skepticism is of D.C., if it is a federal power, the leading police authorities, the leading enforcement arms of the federal government are not going to be remade in the image that you're wanting it to be. The existence of the FBI and these sort of federal military wings, domestic military wings of the government are always going to be to crack down on sentiment here. Connor, I know that you've have similar thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, a point I've made, especially in one article, I think from late last year, is that this has been the case the entire time. At least I was focusing on the FBI. There are a lot of people talk about this as if this was at one point, an effective law enforcement agency that was then corrupted. But all you have to do is look back at the history. And one thing I focus on a lot, because a lot of other people don't, is the origins of the FBI and the fact that it was founded by Napoleon's grandnephew, which is just a fun fact, a Bonaparte, who was the AG. And it was during a time when heads of state were getting assassinated by these anarchists. And so, and in fact, McKinley was killed. Teddy Roosevelt came in, his vice president, and it was Teddy Roosevelt's AG Bonaparte that created the FBI. And he did so completely behind the backs of Congress. By law, he had to go to Congress and get approval for this new bureau. and Congress came back with like an emphatic no. And then he just waited for them to break for the summer and just created it anyway. And pretty quickly, the reason Congress didn't want to go along with it at the time, they're certainly fine with the FBI now, was that they thought it would just be like this secret police of the presidency. And it kind of was at the beginning, but really with Hoover coming in, he sort of turned it into he kind of turned it into his own personal secret police, and it became much more of this entity that serves the permanent power structure in D.C. But yeah, like certainly, like Bill talked about earlier, during the 60s, they really went after the left and were infiltrating them, and that continued with the right in the 90s, like we're talking about. 9/11 really shifted everything up, but they really went hard at young Muslim men especially. And really around that time, they really started to adapt this new tactic that I think defines what they do these days, which is essentially creating these sting operations where, and you saw this, there's a great book called The Terror Factory by Trevor Aronson that goes over this specifically in the post 9/11 years, where they would go find these often mentally not okay or, mentally slow young Muslim men that were sort of adrift in life, and they, some person presenting themselves as this operative of Al Qaeda with a ton of money would come find them and offer them a role to play in this cause, kind of give them a purpose in life, give them all these resources, help basically create this whole terror plot. And then, of course, because the whole thing was fake, the FBI would come in at the end, they'd throw this kid in prison for the rest of their life, and they would act like they just saved the day. And I really think you started to see the same thing happening as we sort of moved away from that post 9/11 period. The target was put back on the right in a lot of ways. Like there was that case of it was the Michigan militia that tried to kidnap the governor there, and then it turned out that a tremendous amount of these guys were actually active FBI informants, and there was some interesting things there with how they stormed the Capitol a few months before January 6th, which is why people were sort of suspicious of this very politically convenient event happening on January 6th. But anyway, so my point is this has been the case with the FBI specifically, but it's true with DEA, ATF, all these agencies the entire time. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning with the right is wrong to look at, this is sort of what Kash Patel was coming in and Dan Bongino, they're sort of acting like the problem with the FBI was, just that they got a bit distracted from their law enforcement duties, and they're just kind of putting them back on track. But the law enforcement duties, they've sort of just been this fake justification the whole time. Really the way to look at this organization and all these agencies is that they're domestic intelligence agencies that are protecting the power structure in D.C. And this Oklahoma City is one example where to the point you were making, Bill, the sort of mainstream story literally doesn't make any sense whatsoever. What was most likely happening here, a lot of people debate it, but it's not to the point you're making, it's not like if you're saying, it's not what the feds are saying, then you have to jump to this was orchestrated and put together by Bill Clinton. There's a lot of possibilities, and in my head, the most reasonable one is that the not just the FBI, but the ATF, they had a lot of informants in this group that put together this bombing plot. And then for whatever reason, I guess on the the nefarious side of it, maybe they let the bombing happen. I think there's a more plausible explanation is that they were planning to come in at the end of the day and sort of have this, last second foil of this plot. And they lost track of the plot before it happened, and then went through and started covering up all this stuff and trying to present this as a lone wolf attack when actually there was this group that put it together. That you mentioned Carol Howe was one of the ATF informants who told her handlers that she went on a drive with this group scouting out potential bombing targets, and one of them was this Murrah building in Oklahoma City. So it's not necessarily that this was all some big contrived thing, but I think it actually fits quite nicely into how the FBI has been operating, especially since the 60s, but really for its whole history. And that is the kind of thing that's rattling around in my head when I see stories like Trump taking over D.C. I'm against violent crime, but man, we should be really skeptical of these agencies.
Oh, yeah. And here's another thing. Look, don't think for a second Patel is not going to protect the FBI first. That none of these folks are going to do anything that is going to really tell the truth about the agencies that they work for. Not going to happen. You're not going to see the FBI finally admitting, yes, they killed Kenneth Trentadue. He was murdered in his cell, because then they'd have to go find somebody to charge him with the murder. This is not going to happen. It always will be more of the same, and this is where I think the MAGA folks have felt, all right, finally we have the people in. They're going to clean up this mess. They're going to drain the swamp, and that we're going to set this stuff right again. And these organizations, it's not like they were functioning properly at one time and then they got overwhelmed by the swamp. They always were part of the swamp. I mean,
nature.
Yeah, I mean, the FBI during the 20s gave us, they spied on people that were against U.S. participation in World War I. We had the Palmer raids during the 1920s. The FBI basically is an internal CIA. That's really what it is. Look, I like to watch Dick Wolf shows as much as anybody else, but don't be fooled by them. The agents are not these law enforcement people, who super cops who swoop in at the last second. I think that, my gut feeling is that what happened to Oklahoma City, it got away from them. That probably there was really no one in charge per se, and it happened. But no doubt, again, once it did happen, I mean, the Democratic Party still is 30 years later, they're still getting reaping benefits from this. And I think that it's the same playbook, though, whether or not, like, I was talking to my wife and stepdaughter today about Newburgh and, what happened at Newburgh, New York. They uncovered a terror plot. Well, the whole thing was a joke from the beginning. But there was the news. There were the CBS and ABC and CNN and Fox. They're all presenting the same story. The FBI has broken up a terror plot. Well, there was no terror plot. And there certainly was no credible terror plot. And so I cannot tell you. Ultimately what happened, and Roberts doesn't either. Roberts doesn't come up with she comes up with basically a lot of plausible storylines, asks the right questions, but we're never going to know, and certainly the FBI is never going to out itself on this.
Well, and that's the thing. It's revisionist history, which, this is in a contemporary sphere. The goal is not to answer every single question. It is to untangle the government propaganda from the history that was used to its ends. And so this is obviously why revisionist history has been so key to the Mises Institute's mission for 40 plus years now. It's why topics like this are so important, because it's not only about better understanding the past, but seeing its connections to issues going on in the current day. And so this is why, again, interesting connection here with federal law and order. I can already see, a Dick Wolf show about, FBI agents arresting people in D.C. It seems maybe Trump can get one of those with some of the leverage he has on some of the broadcast agencies going on right now. But on that topic, this has been Power and Market this week. If you've made it through the episode, a reminder that we're going to be in beautiful Delray Beach, Florida, on October 16th through the 18th, talking about economic freedom, the key to liberty. And a little heads up to our audience, we will soon be giving away copies of a Hayek book, Hayek for the 21st Century. We've got 100,000 free copies we're going to be giving away, so be on the lookout in your email and on our website for the opportunity to get your free copy of that important book. For Connor O'Keefe, for Bill Anderson, for the Mises Wire editorial team, Again, this has been Power and Market. I've been your host, Tho Bishop, today. Enjoy the rest of your week and proceed ever more boldly.